morning and welcome to the Washington Legal Foundation's Media Briefing Program. I'm Glenn Lammy, Chief Counsel of the Foundation's Legal Studies Division. For those of you not familiar with our work, we are in our 38th year of public interest law and policy advocacy in the federal and state courts through the publication of legal studies in a variety of different lengths and on a wide range of issues that affect the free enterprise system, and also through programs such as this one, our web seminars. We also have a very widely trafficked blog called Legal Pulse that I encourage you to keep an eye on as well. And also we have almost all of our resources online, so if you are watching on the internet today, if you want to spend some time afterwards to check out what we're up to on this and other issues, I certainly encourage you to do that. For many years after the passage of the Hatch-Waxman Act, the federal government's position on labeling of generic drugs was, quote-unquote, sameness. In other words, the generic product label had to be the same as its reference listed drug. The Solicitor General espoused this view as recently as last year in its amicus brief in the Mutual Pharmaceutical versus Bartlett case before the Supreme Court. And Representative Henry Waxman, who is, of course, the Waxman of the Hatch-Waxman Act, stated in a 2011 amicus brief, quote, "It is clear that a generic and brand name label must be the same and that a generic firm cannot unilaterally change its label." In that 2013 amicus brief, however, the federal government telegraphed that change was coming, a change which could expose generic drug firms to products liability litigation and sweep away the sameness of labels which the healthcare system had come to rely upon. FDA delivered that change, an early holiday present to the products liability lawyers, with its November 2013 proposal. The Washington Legal Foundation filed comments with the FDA on this proposal last week. We're honored to host this program this morning, which will evaluate FDA's proposal from a number of different angles. And as Ralph said before we got started, there really are a lot of different angles here to talk about. I'm going to introduce our speakers in the order in which they will give their presentations, and then we'll be taking questions from our online viewers. Just email us at interactive@wlf.org, and we will present your question to the speakers. Leading off is Ralph Neas, who is President and CEO of the Generic Pharmaceutical Association. For more than 30 years, Mr. Neas has been a highly successful leader, coalition builder, and advocate on civil rights, civil liberties, health, and consumer issues. Prior to joining the Generic Pharmaceutical Association, Mr. Neas was President and CEO of the National Coalition on Healthcare. For 14 years, he served as Executive Director of the Nonpartisan Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, and for 8 years, he was President and CEO of People for the American Way. Following him will be Alex Brill, who is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he studies a variety of fiscal and economic policy issues. He also works on healthcare reform, pharmaceutical spending, and drug innovation. Before joining EEI, Mr. Brill served as policy director and chief economist of the House Ways and Means Committee. He also served on the staff of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Finishing up today will be our own Richard Samp, who is chief counsel of Washington Legal Foundation. He regularly litigates in federal court and has represented WLF on comments and requests for rulemakings. He has filed with numerous federal agencies, including most prominently the Food and Drug Administration. Ralph, if you could get us started.
Glenn, thank you so much. It's great to be here. Quite frankly, it's wonderful to be back here. As Glenn, I believe, knows, for 30 years, the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights was right down the block at 2027 Massachusetts. So I used to pass this building often, and I knew many of the people who occupied the building, and I got to work with and against the Washington Legal Foundation on many issues during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and right up until the present. And I've also had an opportunity to work with them. And we've talked about our areas of agreement. And what I like most about working with the generic pharmaceutical industry is that our issues are neither Republican, nor Democrat, nor liberal, nor conservative. On our issues, we can appeal to Tea Party fiscal conservatives and consumer liberals and everyone in between. We're talking about not only innovation issues and protecting innovation and competition, we're talking about access and affordability. Very importantly, we're talking about the sustainability of our healthcare system, and I would argue our national economy. I believe the generic pharmaceutical industry is part of the solution with respect to addressing the cost issues that really, quite frankly, have gotten out of control over the last number of decades, with one notable exception: Prescription drugs have either gone down or remained stable now for several years, first time in 5-6 decades. You mentioned Hatch-Waxman, Glenn. This is the 30th anniversary year of Hatch-Waxman. I would say, after all my years with the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and Senator Brooke and Senator Durberg, and having an opportunity to work on all of the key civil rights laws and an opportunity to work on issues of concern to all Americans, Hatch-Waxman may be one of the most effective laws ever enacted. No one would have believed in 1984 how remarkable this success would be. And it's an exquisitely balanced act. It strikes that balance between protecting innovation, but also promoting access to affordable medicines and to making sure that the American public will have the medicines that protect quality of life and access to medicines that can save their lives. How successful has it been? Well, you look at 1984, 19% penetration in the United States with respect to generic scripts. 10 years later, it was 36%. 10 years later, it was 54%. Now it's 84% of the market is generic at 27% of the cost. Enormous savings. In fact, the IMS Health has showed $1.2 trillion saved in the last 10 years by generic medicines. $217 billion in 2012 alone. 3.2 billion scripts per year. 60 million generic medicines are prescribed every single week. That's astonishing. Hundreds of millions of Americans are the beneficiaries and countless millions across the globe. Now, this Hatch-Waxman Act, I said it was exquisitely balanced. The most important foundation for Hatch-Waxman is sameness. Everything is predicated on sameness. What generic manufacturers have to show in order to get their products approved is that their products have the same active pharmaceutical ingredient, the same dosage, the same strength, the same efficacy, the same route of administration, and for purposes of this discussion, the same label. It has to be the same label, and the law has been clear, the regulatory enforcement has been clear, the Supreme Court decisions have been clear. Once this sameness is shown, only the FDA, which is the only entity that has all of the information, all the data, all the science, from the brands, including clinical trials, including the history of the brand when it was under patent, all of the generics, and most people, I think, know that there are 7 or 8 or 9 generics on average for every brand product. All the scientific literature, all the scientific expertise is at the FDA. That's why the FDA is supposed to make a decision with respect to labeling based on science, only based on science. The generics, if they can show sameness in every respect, don't have to do clinical trials. They don't have to do many of the things that cost a lot of money that the brands do during the formulation of a brand in that first 20 years of patent protection. And they also, once the FDA approves, they have got, in essence, the good housekeeping seal of approval. Once the FDA says it's the same for 30 years, and hopefully many more, the generic manufacturers are not subject to failure to warn lawsuits. Many times that's been challenged over the last 30 years. It wasn't just Mensing and Bartlett in 2011 and 2013. There were many attempts to say, now listen, we should make the generic companies liable to failure to warn. But the courts, for 30 years, no final decision ever said that the trial bar was right on this point, that the generics were subject to failure to warn cases. Does that mean that they're free from liability? No. This is what I hear all the time. The generic companies are not liable if something goes wrong. The generic manufacturers are liable if there's a manufacturing defect. If there's a manufacturing defect, then someone can sue the generic manufacturer. If there's a misbranding of the label, someone can sue the manufacturer. But there's also an absolute requirement for generic manufacturers to update labeling information. You wouldn't know that from some of the debate that we've heard from the other side. especially the trial lawyers. But this is the fact. Every year, generic manufacturers have to file a safety report. They have to do it every quarter. But most importantly, if there is a serious and unexpected adverse event, the generic manufacturer has to report within 15 days. If it doesn't, it's subject to penalty by the FDA. It could be a warning letter initially, and if a generic manufacturer continues not to comply, the FDA can say, we're going to force you to withdraw your product. There's always been an incentive for a generic manufacturer to comply with the regs. Mensing and Bartlett changed nothing with respect to the law. Mensing and Bartlett changed nothing with respect to incentives. We've got legal incentives, but we also want these products, they have to be protecting the public health, but we also want to keep the public confidence. We want consistency in labels. We want the public confidence. When the FDA says it's the same, it's important that the American people believe it. It's bioequivocally the same. So here you have this bedrock principle for 30 years. The FDA must make the decision with respect to labeling, and it has to be based on science. So Mensing and Bartlett come down and affirm the law of the last 30 years. And then all of a sudden, lots of political pressure on the FDA from certain members of Congress, from the trial lawyers and others. And quite frankly, we reached out to the FDA after Mensing a couple of times in 2012, several more times in 2013. We knew what kind of pressure they were under. And we also wanted to see, is there any way we can improve? Can we streamline? Can we make it more efficient? But we reached out and said, let's collaborate. Unfortunately, the FDA would not meet to discuss substantively anything to do with the Mensing issues. I was surprised to learn just a couple of months ago, and Dr. Janet Woodcock confirmed it on April 3rd, that the FDA met with only one entity during this time. The FDA met with the trial lawyers in February of 2013. There's nothing wrong with that. The trial lawyers are effective. I know I rooted for them with respect to tobacco litigation. But sometimes they're wrong, and I believe they were wrong on the law and on policy and in many other ways. But that's okay. They can talk to anybody they want to. But it's incumbent upon the FDA to be inclusive, to exercise due diligence. Just as they've done in other proposed rules, before the proposed rules, they shouldn't have talked not just with the brands and the generic manufacturers. They should have talked to patient advocates. They should have talked to physicians. They should have talked to pharmacists. They should have talked to everybody in the pharmaceutical supply chain to put up a proposed rule, if they were going to do that, that reflected input from all concerned parties. They did not do that, and that's extremely disappointing. And on November 8th, we find out that the FDA incorporated virtually everything that the trial lawyers and public citizens had asked for in their public comments. Every major issue, the FDA basically said, by their action, we're going with the trial lawyers and public citizen. Now, I've got several problems. GPHA has several problems with this. Number one, it flies in the face, not just of the Supreme Court, not just the plain meaning of Hatch-Waxman, which says the labels shall be the same. There's no ambiguity. Flat, declarative sentence. But I, speaking of working with the Washington Legal Foundation or against the Washington Legal Foundation on occasion, have been in a position in my career to be with associations or entities that said the Supreme Court got it wrong. The way an entity, whether it's on the outside or the inside, if you disagree with the Supreme Court, if you disagree with what Congress has done, you go to Congress to change the law. You don't act by executive fiat. And that's what's happened here. The FDA decided that it would change the law. I've seen an editorial congratulating them for changing the law. But the FDA does not have the legal authority to change the law when the statute is so clear and it's been affirmed by the Supreme Court twice. That's the legal issue. The public health issue maybe the most important issue right now is that I said before the FDA is the only entity that has all of the data from the brands and the generics, the multiple generics, all the literature, the only one qualified to change a label. So what does the proposed rule do? What does it do? It allows the generic manufacturer, which might have 15% of the market, 20, 30% of the market, to unilaterally change the label, to send out letters to health providers, to post on a website what they're doing. Now, that might seem superficially appealing to some, but what if you don't have vital information? What if you don't know what the FDA knows or what the brands know about the clinical trials? Maybe this adverse event that you just reported is an aberration. Maybe it is something that's already been addressed by the FDA. But the FDA puts in motion this Rube Goldberg contraption where all of this information is put up for the public, and it might be wrong because that generic manufacturer has incomplete information. He's given it to the FDA because they've got all the information. The FDA should work with the generic manufacturers, because on average there are 8 of them for every brand product, should work with the brand, should work with everybody until they have got the science right, and then simultaneously every generic company and the brand should change the label. If you don't, if this becomes final, we could have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 or more different labels, every generic manufacturer, every brand. That's going to cause massive confusion, significant confusion for the pharmacists, for the doctors, for the manufacturers, for the patients. This is not where we want to go because confusion can cause patient endangerment with respect to safety. It could lead to non-adherence. It could lead to many negative outcomes when you've got confusion leading to jeopardizing patient safety. Let's do this right. So you've got the confusion issues, and Alex Brill is going to talk about the cost issues. Again, Hatch-Waxman wanted to provide affordable medicines. If for the first time generic manufacturers are subject to tort liability, it will be conservatively, and I should have responded at a hearing last week, conservatively $4 billion a year. But that's the tip of the iceberg. Who will pay for this? Patients, consumers, physicians, nurses, pharmacists, everybody in the healthcare system. So you've got the legal issues, you've got the confusion and cost issues. This would undermine the safety of the patient, the savings of the patient. It would undermine this proposed rule, the continued vitality of Hatch-Waxman. I started out saying it's exquisitely balanced. Well, this will knock one of the foundations down. And we may lose all the benefits of Hatch-Waxman if this becomes a final rule. That's why so many have filed comments. 60-something% of the comments have come from those having concerns about this proposed rule. Virtually everyone in the pharmaceutical supply chain, led by those first defenders in this case, the pharmacists, the people on the ground who are dispensing the medicines. They have concerns about the confusion issues, the cost issues. Everyone, every major player in the pharmaceutical supply chain has expressed concerns. A couple of dozen patient advocate, disability, minority, veterans organizations have expressed concerns about the confusion issues. Many of them basically say, how come we weren't consulted? This was a fait accompli, the proposed rule, before we even knew anything about it. Good point. They should have been consulted, as with everybody else who has a stake in this and trying to protect the public health of the American people. The National Patient Safety Foundation. Only mission, patient safety. We've got concerns. AARP writes in, we've got concerns about the confusion this could engender and on other issues. Our friendly competitors, Pharma and Bio, they write and express their concerns. California's public employee pension funds, Ohio's, everyone who's a payer, they've got concerns. This was ill-advised. This was done without due diligence. It can be corrected easily, and Alex is going to go into, I hope, a wonderful article that he and Bob Pollack and Scott Gottlieb, two former high-ranking FDA officials. We talked to so many people who had worked at FDA. We talked to so many people who have associated with HHS. They are perplexed as to how this happened. It doesn't seem like the FDA. This is not science-based. This is not a science-based decision. But if we can get the right reforms at the FDA, this is really a political sideshow, because this can be done without changing the rules, certainly without changing the laws. If the FDA needs additional resources to comply with the law and to make sure everyone is acting consistently with the law, let's get those additional resources there. Very importantly, technology. They've been studying e-labeling for 5 years. Why do we still have paper labels? Why don't they go to e-labeling? Most of Congress wants it. They've been studying it for 5 years. E-labeling becomes something that FDA does simultaneously, labels for the generics, for the brands, everybody at the same time, same label. They talk a lot about, at the FDA, the Sentinel program in their global database. Well, why can't we use those systems, not just to collect data, but to do the analytics? They, at the FDA, should be able to simultaneously, whether it's e-labeling, the global data system, and mining it properly, or the Sentinel system, they should be able to get from their 600,000 data points they get every year, including information from us and from pharmacists and doctors, they should be able to make decisions based on science in a timely way, and they should be able to do it simultaneously for everybody. So let's not kill the rule. Let's improve the rule. Let's provide the additional resources that the FDA should have. Let's act consistently with the law, and let's make sure the FDA protects those who should be protected by the FDA. If there are policy changes, if someone wants to address the Supreme Court, if someone wants to change the law, go to the right forum. It's not the FDA. Their mission is to protect the public health. Congress makes policy. Let's act consistent with the law. Let's act consistent with the concern for the public health of the American people. I took 3 minutes extra, Glenn, and I apologize, but there were some important things to say, and I apologize to my panelists.
Thank you, Ralph. Alex?
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Ralph, for your comments. Thank you to the Washington Legal Foundation and for everyone who's here this morning and here via video as well. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this rule and the work that I've done on it, both with my colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute, as well as some work that I've done as a consultant for the GPHA on the cost, the true cost, or part of the true cost of what I believe that this rule will impose on the economy if it's finalized in the form that it was originally proposed. Let me take a step back. Ralph covered a lot of really great material on this rule and its origins and its impact. So let me try to fill in and complement that and add a few additional facts. Let me start by just commenting a little bit about the core function of the Food and Drug Administration with regard to drug policy, generic drugs and drugs. Their core function is to promote the public health. Right? That's the purpose for the Food and Drug Administration. And so we can argue about how to do that and if they're doing that well, but that's the objective for the agency. If you look at the rule and you say, how does this rule fit in the overall broad core function of the FDA, or if you look at the testimony that was put forth by Janet Woodcock at the House Subcommittee hearing last week, or any of the commentary that you've seen from the FDA, and ask the question, how does this fit into that framework? Well, what they say when they talk about the rule, what the rule says itself, is that its intent is to create parity. And parity is a great sounding issue, right? I mean, who's not for parity, right? Let's have a level playing field. Let's have fairness. Right? It sounds very appealing when you say that there is a lack of parity out there, and we want to correct that and balance things out. Create parity in the process. That's what this rule is about. And what does that mean? What parity and what process are they referring to? The FDA is very explicit, and Ralph described this very effectively, and we know from reading the recent Supreme Court decisions that a plaintiff can bring a case on a failure to warn case against a brand drug company if they don't like the label, and they cannot bring that case against a generic. And as Ralph described, generic drugs are generating tremendous savings in the economy today, and they're permeating the pharmaceutical industry. 84% of all prescriptions filled are generic drugs. And as that number has increased over the last 30 years, the market opportunity for trial lawyers shrinks because the Supreme Court says that only the patients who take the brand drugs can bring suit against the manufacturers, but in the 16% of the market share. But for those who have consumed generic drugs, that opportunity does not exist. That's the lack of parity. And so the issue is parity in process, right? On one hand, the parity is the inability to bring suit, and then the other perspective is the parity means the inability to unilaterally, the opportunity, they would say, to unilaterally change a label. I would say an obligation or a mandate to change labels. But those are process issues, right? And those are legal issues. And so the question becomes, are they also public health issues? Right? Does that somehow fit into or fit under the core function or objective or responsibility of the Food and Drug Administration? By creating this parity, are we somehow improving public health? I think it's very clear the impacts it will have on the courts, and I'll get into that in a moment as I've attempted to quantify it. But are we creating some benefit in addition to the cost? There was a hearing last week in the House of Representatives. Members have raised a point in that hearing that the rule will create better labels, and that as a result of these better labels, that people are less likely to get sick and fall and require public assistance. That assertion was made at the hearing, that people won't end up on disability, they won't end up on Medicaid, and that will save the government dollars. It's an interesting idea. So the question, obviously, that follows that assertion would be, what's the evidence? And so the first place one might look is to the FDA. Does the FDA make this claim? Does the FDA claim that by providing this parity in process that there is this public health benefit? And the answer, quite simply, is no, they don't. The rule that they put forth, including the cost-benefit analysis that was subsequently released by the FDA, makes no quantified estimate of the benefits of this rule, which is strange for an agency, again, whose primary task is to provide that benefit, to improve the public health. Right? There are other agencies that are sort of more process-oriented, ones where perhaps the benefits could be simply that the processes are streamlined. But the FDA, in their proposed rule, estimates and quantifies zero benefit from this change. They also estimate roughly zero cost. So you might look at the rule and from the FDA's perspective and say, it's a wash. Maybe this is a technical thing. This is just a little rule just changing the mechanics of the process. And so when I first came to this issue and first started to study this proposed rule, I focused on one aspect of the cost, and that is the cost of the liability, the additional burden, the liability burden that will be brought to the generic manufacturers and, as I'll describe in a second, passed on in terms of higher costs to consumers and payers as a result of the proposed rule. And when I first read the rule, and the issue, I admit, was somewhat new to me, I'll almost say amused. I thought it was lousy. It was overly simplistic, because it seemed as that on its face very simple to understand that at the moment, today, under current law, in the current legal environment that we face, post-mensing, generic manufacturers unambiguously don't face liability with regard to failure to warn claims. And it's also clear, perfectly clear from the rule, that if the rule is finalized, that they will. And so that change will result in additional liability. Now, how much liability? One could debate. I have an estimate. But if you look at what the FDA says, they say it's zero. And so it struck me at first as almost amusing that they would assert that the cost with regard the liability cost would be zero. But as I got into this in greater detail and started to think not only about the liability cost but the other consequences of this rule, I started to get more frustrated. I started to get more concerned about the process really running afoul. And so Ralph talked in nice detail about the Hatch-Waxman legislation and the sameness principles for generic drugs. And many legal experts have raised the point that this rule violates that sameness principle. The FDA doesn't have the authority under Hatch-Waxman to make this change. But there are other statutes that I think are relevant here as well, in particular the Administrative Procedures Act, the APA. And I certainly am not an expert in that act, but in essence, it is about the process of rulemaking. And in part, it is about the need for appropriate and accurate and quality cost-benefit analysis. And so the FDA assigns a zero cost to the liability. They assign a zero to the benefit. And they assign an inconsequential overhead administrative paperwork type burden of thousands of dollars per year. We know, though, that of course there will be a liability consequence of this rule. And I looked at this question. To be honest, it's a difficult question to estimate because this liability has not previously been imposed on the generic industry. So the question is how can we find a comparable, something elsewhere in the economy that we could look at as a model, understand the liability that's faced in that space or that industry, and then translate that burdens back to the generic industry and say, if the generic industry faced a similar liability, what would it be? And so that was our approach. What I did in my research is I looked at the brand pharmaceutical industry, would be the closest proxy, and drawing on data on the size of that industry, the number of prescriptions in that industry, and making an estimate about the expected liability that that industry would pay, we estimate that generic drug costs will, or the burden imposed as a result of this rule from a liability perspective is $1.16 per prescription. Dollar a script, right? $1.16 a script. Is that a lot or is that a little? Well, as Ralph described and as I mentioned a moment ago, generics are very popular today, right? 84% of the marketplace are generic drugs, retail prescriptions. And so because of the prevalence of generics in the industry, $1.16 per prescription is in fact quite a lot. In total, this equals $4 billion annually in new costs for private and public payers. Why for the payers? Why not for the drug manufacturers? Why don't they just suck it up, right? Why don't they just take it in as a cost of doing business? Well, the generic drug industry is fundamentally different than the brand sector in one important way. It's a competitive marketplace. It's a competitive marketplace because, as Ralph noted, on average there are roughly 8 generic manufacturers manufacturing every product, every individual product. So for a particular drug that has, for which the patents have expired and generics have entered the market, it's not just one generic that enters to make that product. It's on average 8. And those companies compete vigorously with each other for market share. And they compete on price. In fact, they can only compete on price because the principles of Hatch-Waxman, the sameness principles, mean that everything else about the drug is the same. So the only way that they can compete with each other is on the price dimension. And as a result, 8 competitors in a market competing only on one dimension will result in a competitive market. What that means is that the prices will be driven down. And we know today that generic drugs are far less expensive than brand drugs, 80 to 85% cheaper on average. And from economics, we know that in a competitive marketplace, the price of a product is equal to its marginal cost. That means that they don't have any room to go. They don't have any cushion. Doesn't mean they don't make any profit at all, but they don't make any extra profit. They make a normal expected return. And in a marketplace like that, when the costs go up, the prices go up. And so one would expect that with the additional burden of this liability for failure to warn claims, that burden, which we estimate at $4 billion a year, would be passed forward to payers. Who are the payers? Well, the payers are the payers same as the payers in the healthcare sector generally, private payers and the government. The government has a huge share of the healthcare market. We estimate that of this $4 billion additional cost, $1.5 billion will fall on the government through Medicare, Medicaid, and other programs that the government operates, and $2.5 billion will fall on private insurance and the public. Could mean higher copays, could mean higher health insurance premiums, could mean higher out-of-pocket costs for individuals. And that estimate and that framework and that analysis was the focus of the original report that I wrote. Subsequently to that, Bob Pollack and Scott Gottlieb and I at the American Enterprise Institute dug a little bit deeper into this issue, looked at it from a broader perspective. And it's from that perspective that I started to think about the lack of benefit and other costs. And Ralph did a really nice job describing the confusion effects that may likely exist if the rule is finalized as proposed. And I think that those are real and important concerns. In addition, I'm particularly troubled by a concern that the FDA for a long time shared, which is referred to as the concern regarding overwarning. What this means is there's a balance to be struck with the drug label. We want to provide patients or pharmacists or physicians good information about the benefits and the costs or the warnings or the risks associated with any drug. We want to do that in a fair way. There is such a thing as too many warnings, right? Because if you put on too many warnings that are inappropriate, I mean, if the drug deserves many warnings, that is appropriate. But if you put on more warnings to protect yourself from a liability risk, you then run the risk of overwarning the patients or the pharmacists or the doctors. The consequences of that is you may discourage people from taking the drug that they should be appropriately taking. And this is a long-standing issue and concern for the Food and Drug Administration. Going back to the 70s, in rulemaking and in other forums, the Food and Drug Administration has opined on the risks of overwarning. Nothing will create an incentive for overwarning like the proposed rule that's before the FDA right now. As a defensive matter, knowing that from the perspective of a generic drug company, knowing that they face potential liability risks for failure to warn claims, and that their competitors in the marketplace also face those similar risks, they will be incentivized to constantly update their label to make stronger and stronger warnings, to fend off that liability risk. Every new rumor or nugget of information or suggestion that there may be a risk associated with their drug that they hadn't previously warned about, or importantly, hadn't warned adequately about, will encourage them to make a change on their label. Now, the Food and Drug Administration for years has worried about the consequences of overwarning. In this rule, they make no acknowledgement of that possibility whatsoever. And in fact, in this rule, they suggest that these label changes will be few and far between. I think that the incentive effect that they're missing in this rule will be this, in essence, race to the bottom, where generic manufacturers will rush out and be encouraged through market forces to protect themselves from this liability by making additional changes that are unnecessary. Now, I mentioned that there are warnings and stronger warnings. One of the arguments that we've heard from Public Citizen in support of this rule is they have noted that drug labels change not only when the drugs are new, but they change long after the drug is launched. Long after the drug is initially launched, we continue to learn about that drug and the consequences and side effects that that drug may impose. And as a result, the labels continue to change over time. That's true. We found that in our own research as well. But Public Citizen implies or suggests that because of this, we need to be able to quickly change the labels even after they've been on the market for a long time. But what they miss, and one of the things that we discuss in our article, is that the type of label changes that occur when a product has been on the market for a number of years and has gone generic are very different than the types of label changes that can occur when a product is new. When a product has gone generic, when a product is older and has been on the market for a long time, almost everything is known about that drug, but not everything. But the changes that occur to that label late in that product's life are small. It has to do generally with the way that the warning is described or where on that label that warning appears. And in fact, if you look at the litigation that's often brought in these types of cases, it's not that rarely is the case made that the warning that the side effect was completely unknown and that was completely unwarned, didn't appear anywhere on the label. It's that the wording, it's the choice of words or where on the warning appeared. There may be legitimate issues about how to construct the label so that it's clear for the pharmacist or the consumer, but those issues don't require the immediate label change process that's being suggested here by the FDA, what's known as the CBE0 process. So on the benefit side, no express benefits. On the cost side, $4 billion in additional liabilities. In addition, the confusion effect that Ralph described, the overwarning consequence where people will not take the medicines that they need, and the adverse results that will ensue from that. Those costs, the confusion and the overwarning, are difficult to quantify, so they're not part of the study that I conducted. But I am increasingly convinced that they are real and significant costs as well, and that they are contrary to the fundamental objective of the Food and Drug Administration, promoting the public health. And so then the question becomes, well, if not this rule, then what? Well, so for one option obviously would be simply there's nothing wrong with the status quo, might be one view. But if one did think that there should be a process by which we should improve label changes, I think that it can be achieved without the increased liability cost and without the increased risk of overwarning that might also ensue and the confusion effect that Ralph described. For one, the FDA could assume this responsibility themselves. Is that an impossible task for the Food and Drug Administration? Is that a burden that they don't have the resources for? I don't think so. I think that it would. As Ralph described, they would have access to the information on a broad spectrum of users, more so than any individual generic drug company. And furthermore, if they don't have the resources, I think that the additional burden to provide those resources are relatively modest. And could be either drawn from existing user fees or through additional fees if necessary. All of that would be ridiculously less costly than the current proposed rule. And alternatively, either in complement or in substitute, the FDA could provide a process for expedited review of label changes through what's known as the prior approval supplements, the PAS process. This is a process whereby drug companies notify the FDA of their desire to change their label. They tell them why. They discuss it with the FDA. And if the FDA agrees, the label changes occur across the spectrum, across the board for all manufacturers. This would address the confusion issue. This would allow FDA to protect against the overwarning issue. And this would guard against the additional liability costs from the failure to warn claims. So in conclusion, let me just say that we have no identified benefits. I've quantified at least $4 billion worth of costs, but I think that that's an underestimate, and I think that there are certainly other ways that the FDA could improve the process to strengthen and improve the quality of the drug labels, if that's even necessary.
Thank you, Alex. Great.
Thank you very much. I wanted to cover some of the legal issues involved here. We've heard why this change that is being proposed by FDA may not make a lot of policy sense. I want to talk a little bit about the nature of state tort law and why that is driving what is being proposed here by FDA. I think, as Ralph pointed out, there really is very little effort by FDA to justify its proposal as a legal matter. It's very clear that when Congress passed the Hatch-Waxman Act in Section 355J4G of the Act, Congress mandated that the label of a generic drug had to be the same as the label of the brand name drug. So FDA, as I've said, really made little effort in its proposed rule to explain why it could create an exception to that. The very clear reason why they are proposing this rule is that they would like to overrule the Supreme Court's decisions in the Pleva case and in the Mutual versus Bartlett case. But I'll get to that as to whether they'll even accomplish that objective at all. I think it's very possible that the Supreme Court won't defer in any way to what FDA has to say. But first, I'd like to focus briefly on the nature of litigation that is brought against drug companies. First, I think the courts have recognized that drugs are a unique product in the sense that they all have risks. Even when taken as directed, some people will react badly to almost any drug. Aspirin has been a product that's been on the market for a very long time, but we also know that there are potential bad side effects of taking aspirin, and if you look at your aspirin bottle, they will have right on the bottles all sorts of warnings about when not to use the product. So those sorts of risk and benefit calculations are why we have an FDA. And FDA looks at a product and realizes that there are risks, but also realizes there are benefits. And if FDA, after spending years of analysis of the studies that manufacturers have done, decides that the benefits outweigh the risks, it will grant approval for a drug to get on the market. The drug generally will be given a period of exclusivity either by federal law or by patent law. So only some years later will generic versions of that drug get on the market, and presumably by that time you've had quite a bit of experience weighing the risks versus the benefits, so that yes, it can happen that new information is developed about a drug. But that is not really a major consideration once the exclusivity has ended and generic products are on the market. As Ralph mentioned, this is not a situation where the inability to bring a failure to warn claim in any way blocks injured plaintiffs from filing a tort suit. For one thing, if the product really is defective, if it's been manufactured in some improper way, of course the manufacturer can be sued. However, these types of defective product cases are very hard to bring because most of the drugs are actually made quite well. We also have FDA having determined that, yes, there are risks, but they are outweighed by the benefits. So you would have to convince a jury in many cases, well, really, FDA was wrong in making its determination. And that's why we have the most common type of liability suit brought against pharmaceutical manufacturers is a failure to warn claim. The theory is that you may have had lots of warnings on the label of the drug to warn you about potential side effects of the drug. However, perhaps if you had one more warning on the drug, the doctor would not have prescribed it because he would have said, oh, those 34 warnings weren't enough for me, but number 35 would have made the difference. I would not have prescribed the drug if I had seen that. Therefore, the patient would not have taken the drug and would not have been injured by the drug. Now, the these failure to warn claims basically are the sorts of claims that have dominated the field for some years, and that's why all of the major cases that have gotten up to the Supreme Court have been failure to warn cases. And what the Supreme Court has said is that if FDA prescribes the label and says exactly what has to be on the label, that for a state, by means of its state tort system, decrees that additional warnings have to be provided, that conflicts with the federal rule about warnings, and therefore, as a matter of the superiority of federal law over state law, we're going to say that those claims are preempted. That's not to say that, as I mentioned earlier, that you can't bring other claims against the manufacturer. You just can't bring this one type of claim, a failure to warn claim. And that is what the Supreme Court held in both PLEVA and in Mutual, that the failure to warn claim against a generic manufacturer is preempted. So FDA is bringing this rule for the proposed rule for the very obvious reason of trying to overturn that decision. They make some statements about, oh, well, we want additional safety information to get out there more quickly, but I think all of the evidence suggests that's not why they're going forward. This is an effort to allow more lawsuits to go forward. And as Alex mentions, these additional suits are going to be a very significant cost for the generic industry. However, I don't necessarily agree with him that it's going to lead to more liability. The Supreme Court has repeatedly said that it will not generally defer to federal agencies when it comes to the decision about whether a federal law preempts state law. The Supreme Court has already determined that there will be preemption. Now, it is true that one of the rationales for the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Hatch-Waxman Act was the existence of the FDA rules that said that generic manufacturers could not make unilateral changes in their labeling. Nonetheless, now that they have made that determination that there is preemption of suits against generic manufacturers, in the absence of a new law from Congress, I think it is somewhat doubtful that the Supreme Court would change its mind on the preemption issue. The problem of overwarning that Alex mentioned is a serious problem. And I think it's very clear that manufacturers are going to react to this new rule by saying that we're going to make regular changes in our rules in order to try to protect ourselves, in our warnings to try to protect ourselves. The problem with that, however, is that any resourceful plaintiff's lawyer can always say, well, if you gave these number of warnings, even if you gave additional warnings unilaterally, that those warnings weren't enough. That you can always think of a stronger warning. You can put a black box around the warning. You can put a star next to the warning, something to call the attention of the plaintiff's doctor to the risks that were already known. And I think that the Supreme Court's decision in Wyeth v. Levine illustrates this issue very well, that in that case there were all sorts of warnings that the manufacturer, Wyeth, in that case gave about do not use this particular procedure because it can have serious side effects. The doctor went ahead and nonetheless engaged in that procedure, and the federal claims were held not to be preempted because, according to the New Hampshire courts, you could have had just that number of stronger warnings. Nonetheless, as WLF has said in the comments that it filed with FDA, it is fairly clear that Congress, when it passed the Hatch-Waxman Act, said that there cannot be changes by generic manufacturers in their labeling unilaterally. That's not to say that generic manufacturers should not be reporting new information to FDA on a regular basis, and indeed they do make those sorts of regular reports. Right now, you have a situation where the potential liability of brand name manufacturers is a good deal greater than the potential liability of generic manufacturers, and I guess I agree with Public Citizen that imbalance is bad, and we ought to create parity. And the way we would create that parity, however, is we would say give FDA final authority on all labeling changes, whether or not it is labeling changes by generic manufacturers or by brand name manufacturers. And once you create that situation, you give FDA whatever resources it says it needs in order to make timely decisions about changes in the labels. You will then not have the problem of diverse numbers of labels. Rather, you will have uniform labeling, and you will make sure that generic manufacturers, who, as we've heard here today, have 84% of the market, bear their fair share of the reporting responsibilities, and they do quite a bit now. We're just asking that there be parity, and that FDA itself do the pre-approval of all safety labeling. Now, FDA has, for the last 3 decades, had the very same position that that Congress had, which was that there is no right for generic manufacturers to make these sorts of unilateral changes. When an agency makes a change in its position like that, the Supreme Court has made it very clear it's highly unlikely to defer to the position of the agency that, oh, we made a mistake for 3 decades. Our newest interpretation of federal law is the correct one. Therefore, you should defer to what we have to say about it. Rather, when and if this change goes forward, you can be sure that the courts are going to look at the proposed change based on what Congress initially said ought to be the composition of the labeling of generic drugs. This won't be a situation where the courts are willing to defer to what FDA has had to say, and I think you will find in short order, if this change goes through, there will be legal challenges to it, that courts will be citing to you Section 355J4G. They will tell you that the proposed change violates that provision of federal law. Moreover, I think you will find that the courts will be reluctant to say that FDA has the unilateral right to overrule the Supreme Court's decisions in PLEVA and Mensing, so that even if the rule itself is upheld, I think you will probably not find courts willing to easily agree to the idea of the plaintiff's bar that there ought to be an end to preemption. However, Alex is absolutely right. There are going to be many, many more lawsuits of this sort brought if the rule goes through, and that's why the Washington Legal Foundation filed comments and opposes these changes. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. I wanted to see if there were any questions from the in-person audience first. Any questions? Okay, I'm an in-person audience, so I guess I'll ask a question. One of the things that you did touch on is how this rule will work vis-a-vis the companies that created the reference-listed drug. You may end up with a situation where the generic drug on which the generic drug will have a warning on it that the reference-listed drug will not. So how does that process work under the rule?
Glenn, if I understand it, what additional responsibilities would the brands have?
Right.
under
Again,
their final-
does the generic have a responsibility to inform the brand that it's seeking a new labeling? Because obviously, if the drugs are have a sameness, then the branded drug is not going to have a warning that the generic drug will.
I believe this is what will happen. I use the old-fashioned phrase Rube Goldberg contraption, which might go to my longevity in terms of using that as an example of what I'm talking about. But rather than the way it's been done, where when there will be changes, the FDA will work with the generics and with the brand and make a change, I would like to improve the decision-making time at the FDA, and expedited review may be one way of looking at it. But under the proposed rule, what will happen is that the generic company, as Alex pointed out, the CBE0 will be filed with a new label unilaterally by the generic. It will be posted on a public portal that will necessitate the generic company sending out the Dear Health Provider letters, the posting, all of this public information, which may or may not be accurate, going out there. And then the brand will have an obligation to take a look at this new information. The 7 or 8 other generic companies will have an obligation to take a look at this. So you could set in motion all of this activity, perhaps based on information that is not necessarily accurate and has not been reviewed by the FDA. So everybody, the brand, the 8 generics, the pharmacists, the physicians, everybody is under this new obligation to look at this information that may or may not be worthy of a labeling change. So I think it's a crazy situation that is not a good use of resources, that goes contrary to 30 years of enforcement. And the FDA, rather than doing this the way they're doing it, should do what they should have done in the beginning. There should be a multi-stakeholder collaboration. There should be inclusivity. Everyone, not just informal comments, and I know now they cannot engage in negotiations or bargaining or anything else, something that perhaps they should have done in the year 2 or 3 before the proposed rule, but they can listen. And I think many good suggestions have been made in the comments. There could be others to greatly simplify this and act in accordance with the law and get to where they state they want to be without all the unintended and deleterious consequences of this written proposal. I'm sorry.
I believe that in the proposal itself there was a Rube Goldberg-esque flowchart that showed how all of these things would occur with regards to the reference listed drug and the FDA and the generic drug. So I think that's definitely an apt analogy there for sure. So, Alex, there was no sort of anecdotal evidence that there was a need for this in terms of instances where generics wanted to be able to provide more warnings, but obviously could not unilaterally because of the way that the Hatch-Waxman Act is set up. Was there any discussion of that at FDA in the rule itself and the proposal?
Not in the rule itself, no. In fact, to the contrary, in a letter exchange between a number of Republicans in the House and Senate, a letter they wrote to the FDA, and the FDA's response to that letter on this rule issue, FDA goes out of their way to make the point that this rule is not in response to any concern that they have the generic industry, generic manufacturers are failing to meet their obligations under current law. So they just sort of say, just in very plain English in that letter, make clear that they are not accusing generic manufacturers of their failures in any of these regards, the issues that Ralph described earlier. If there's an adverse event, those events must be reported. They must be reported in a timely fashion. Generic drug industry on net is doing that just as expected. And so this is not in response to any concern in that regard.
Rich, I was wondering if you might provide some thoughts on what sort of legal arguments might be made if there was a Administrative Procedures Act type challenge made to this rule if it is finalized in its current form?
Well, this is actually one of the rare instances of FDA going through formal notice and comment rulemaking. Unfortunately, it's an agency that tends to act informally and regularly violates the APA in order to act quickly. In this instance, FDA is going through the formal process, which takes longer but makes it more difficult to challenge the rule on procedural grounds. But whether or not FDA is dotting its I's and crossing its T's in this particular case, nonetheless, they are faced with a federal statute that is inconsistent with the rule that they are proposing. So I think that the challenge will be much more a substantive challenge rather than a procedural challenge.
Has there been, I'm sorry, Mark.
I had a question for Alex. We were talking before about the parity concern, and I learned a lot from all of the presentations, but one of the things that jumped out at me was when you have the branded pharmaceutical with the monopoly for many years, then those failure to warn claims seem like they're going to be based on maybe genuine failures to warn or genuine concerns. When you go then to a system where you have, and I think, Ralph, you said there's an average of 8 generic manufacturers for each pharmaceutical, suddenly it seems to me that the failure to warn claims may not be based so much on actual failures to warn as inconsistencies across the 8 different labels, where you never had that particular concern when there was just a monopoly pharmaceutical. When you made the estimate for the $4 billion in liability, was that something that you took into consideration, the fact that these inconsistencies in labeling may just on their own generate the opportunity for additional opportunistic litigation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I understand the question, there's in essence that when you have 8 labels or 9 labels, the brand and the 8 generics, and they're all a little bit different, as we expect they may be, then it's very easy to bring suit to say, or if one changes on a Monday and the other one changes on a Thursday, it's very easy for a plaintiff lawyer to say to the second mover, the manufacturer that changed later or that didn't add the 37th warning that was added by one of their competitors, why didn't you warn us sooner? Your competitor did. Why didn't you add this warning? Your competitor did. And that is what will encourage this sort of race to the bottom of overwarning that I described. And so one manufacturer moves first, therefore the other 7 haven't on average, and that opens up that opportunity. And I completely agree that dynamic is very different than the current dynamic, where there's only one label. And now there's only one label on the brand side early in the product's life. What we see the plaintiff's lawyers doing is they're saying, well, there's this piece of evidence out there, or there's that's new, and you didn't reflect that new piece of information. There was a study in another country, or there was this anecdote or that anecdote. You didn't put that on your label. Why not? Or you put that on your label. Why didn't you put it on your label yesterday? Why didn't you put it on last week or the month before? But it's only in that one dimension currently with vis-a-vis one manufacturer. I agree with you completely that in an environment where there are multiple manufacturers, there's multiple opportunities to say you could have done it sooner, someone else did it sooner. A lot of the failure to warn claims that are brought are failure to warn sooner claims. We don't call them that, but that's in essence what they are. Your question is was that in the analysis? And the answer is no. That dynamic, we did not project that there would be an increased number of suits brought relative to the burdens faced by brands. In fact, the opposite. We said that the burden brought to generics will be comparable to that faced by brands, and in that sense, the estimate's conservative.
Would it also be fair to assume that because there usually still is a reference-listed branded drug in the marketplace competing with the generics that are out there that are similar to the current drug, that it would increase liability concerns for the branded drug maker as well?
I think that's right. And again, that is also a burden that we have not estimated. But to the extent that the generics are going out there and making label changes that the brand has not made, then that would pose risks to the brand as well.
One final question for Ralph. Your member companies haven't traditionally had to factor in the risk of this type of litigation to their decision-making as to whether or not to pursue a generic drug introduction into the marketplace. That's another cost, I would imagine, that FDA didn't take into consideration, and how much are your members thinking about that sort of as this process goes forward?
Glenn, that's as to how they have to look at the future with respect to whether they do.
Branded drug companies have to certainly think about that under the Wyeth versus Levine theory, but the generics haven't had to up to this point at all.
And I believe, if I'm understanding the question, I've read your material as well. In your first study and other subsequent talks and articles, this introduces a whole new need for analysis, because this industry, and everyone has referred to the competitive nature of the industry. And sometimes I see things that are written or said about 3 or 4 of the larger generic companies not perhaps understanding the breadth and depth of the industry, literally hundreds of generic manufacturers. And so many of those, and Alex got into this, it's when you get the second, third, fourth, sixth, seventh, and eighth generic manufacturer doing a product that is the same as the brand, where you get these incredible reductions in price, where you get down to 25% or 20% of the cost of a brand. But a lot of these companies, in addition to the race to the bottom that Alex was talking about, if you're small, you get into the space in the first place. If you only got 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 products, can you afford to get into this space with this increased risk of exposure in the tort liability issues? So we're worried about generic manufacturers, especially the smaller ones, the newer ones, not becoming part of this incredibly competitive industry. We're worried about the overwarning. We're the race to the bottom. We're worried that if some of these smaller companies and even the larger companies say this is not worth the risk in this particular area, and there really are some products, especially in the sterile injectables, that it's a much more difficult situation. Do you just not go into the market, and does this exacerbate drug shortages? These are serious policy issues, and I don't think the FDA spent 2 seconds trying to think through not only the issues and the cost-benefit that Alex wrote about, has now spoken about, and I've heard him speak elsewhere, but questions you just raised should be part of this cost-benefit analysis. This is discouraging what Hatch-Waxman sought to encourage. Contrary not only to the letter of the law, this is contrary to the intent of the law.
If I could just add on that point, in the article that I wrote, the original study that I wrote identifies these other types of effects. We don't quantify them, but one of the assumptions underlying the estimate is that in essence that these liability risks would be insurable, and so that there'd be sort of a known cost for companies, that they could sort of understand, they could go out, they could buy the insurance, they pass that risk on to a third party, they raise their prices, and then they go about their business. And there's a lot of reason to think that's not a good assumption, that it actually would be much worse than that, particularly for the small players. That insurance may not be available, that insurance may be too costly, there may be a lot of uncertainty, and I think we heard that in this discussion about what those liability risks will be. Maybe some manufacturers will think that they won't face liability risks, so then they'll go in with a low price. They'll win market share. Then they'll turn out that guess was wrong, and they'll face liabilities that they weren't anticipating. Or maybe some manufacturers will be more conservative. They'll sort of take a worst-case scenario, and they won't let their prices fall to the levels they were previously going to be at, and as a result, they'll lose market share, and they'll be pushed out of the market for that reason. And so there are a lot of other dynamics as we're adding not just a burden to the manufacturers, but we're adding a risk and an uncertain risk that's difficult to predict.
We're a bit past our normal witching hours, but I wanted to thank everyone for joining us here and online today as well. We're going to have the archive of this available by this afternoon, so if any of you might have jumped in late, or you have colleagues who might want to view this, please let them know. If you have any questions about that, email us at interactive@wlf.org. And if you have any questions for the speakers afterwards, I'm sure they'd be happy to answer them by phone. Thanks for joining us.